I'm Matt Jones. I was paid to write about video games in a few places, but this year I've mostly just been down the pub or playing Dota 2. And as a word of advice to anybody who's interested in maintaining a reasonable enough career trajectory in criticism or elsewhere, do your best to avoid distractions like really good video games or towns where you can get a pint of Carlsberg for £2.19. I wrote that joke for London. It's the Christmas season. It's time for some joy, and you presumably have all had some nice cake. Who wants to talk about death? My entire career in games criticism, I've been bored of how video games handle failure. As a human with limited amount of time on Earth, I am frustrated by the thought of repeating myself in a video game because I've made a mistake. I think it's often completely pointless. When you die in a video game, it often results in meaningless repetition, and not just that, it's poorly contextualized and also unnecessary. I think we die and repeat ourselves in a lot of games solely because that's just the vocabulary that designers have for player failure. I want us to get rid of death, or if we can't get rid of it, I want us to properly think about it existing in games at all. There are better ways that we can model failure that don't include death, and I'd love to talk about a few. This is already beginning, by the way. I'm able to write this talk today because I've got handfuls of great examples of death in games being done correctly, and a ton of games about failure without any death whatsoever. For a decent stretch of time, I've been frustrated by the idea of the checkpoint. Like, the idea of a game allowing the player a chance at fixing their mistakes without any kind of context within the game itself. I understand this is a concession for the player as a means of the game exerting difficulty and reaching a clear point where your ability is outmatched by the game's systems, but it is a jarring concept for me. And I pitched this talk to Jake because I've been playing a lot of Shadow of Mordor, and I'll get to that later. But I'd also read a lot of reviews for the recent Tom Cruise movie, Edge of Tomorrow. Did anybody see it? I actually haven't, so. Every reviewer of that movie seemed to agree that the movie felt like a video game because in that film, you haven't seen it. Tom Cruise is a magic shooty man unstuck in time like he's Billy Pilgrim. He gets to go back and retry shooting things again whenever he dies. I got a bit annoyed by that kind of review, like the suggestion that it seems like a video game because obviously you don't shoot things in every video game and not every game has you dying and retrying. I was especially annoyed because in the movie, the process of dying and respawning is way more thought out and contextualized than most games. This mechanic in the film is an essential part of the plot. Dying and restarting in most games is just a thing that happens as a method of impeding progress while you figure out the optimum mode of play. The reason why players should be able to retry should be a question that someone asks at some point during development, like, why do you get to respawn in Watch Dogs? Or, like, Far Cry? Anybody know? Yeah. Are there games about getting another try? Like, are there games about death? Like, there's certainly a lot of death in them, but not really. So when I say death, I mean player character's life points drop to 0, player restarts game at last save, or scripted event occurs based on linear story or choice, character is removed from narrative, game either continues or does not. That works better with PowerPoint, but you've all probably played games? You all probably know what I'm saying here, hopefully? Okay. Death and retrying is fairly prominent. You die in Mario, you lose a 1-up, and you try again. You die in Call of Duty, you get a historical quote or some advice like, don't stand sort of near a grenade, you prick, and then you try again. This process started because side-scrollers in arcades needed a difficulty curve and an end state to get more money from you. You die in those because you've suboptimally understood the game's systems and haven't performed the actions required for success. That's why I can't touch the barrels in Donkey Kong. That's all I want to do. I want to touch the barrels. Kiss the barrels. Love the barrels. Call of Duty 4 was really the first console release that started making any real statement about the process of coming back to life after you die, though obviously Prince of Persia Sands of Time was the first to justify restarting in context, create a narrative reason for deaths in the form of a story taking an unintended and inaccurate twist. I mentioned Modern Warfare because it's a game filled with character death repetition. Being shot, getting told that you should try not to get shot, sometimes you get a quote from Donald Rumsfeld. Eventually you reach the pretty infamous story sequence where the soldier's caught in a nuclear blast. The helicopter crashes to the ground and they die cold and alone. You don't respawn. Contrasted with the rest of the game, it's a pretty amazing moment and a subversion of mechanics. But when you think about it too hard, you think, like, yeah, this moment's unique, but, like, and it gets to be canonical, but like none of the other ones. Like when I died because I stood out of cover for too long, why not that time? I know it requires my character's action within an explicit narrative, but we've designed a system with respawns and checkpoints for everyone, but haven't established the main cause. Like, what's actually the difference in that one unique moment? As a result, the most interesting death in that game isn't the infamous one, it's every other death. Like, those deaths were meaningful to you as a player because they were statements of your inability to properly reflect optimum understanding of how progress is made. That's a sentence. The death in that sequence was inevitable. The other death was a result of you not being good enough at the game, so you had to do it again, and this time you have to be better at it. Even with that all said, even though it's a game where you die and you get another chance, it's actually not a game about that. It's actually about the opposite thing entirely. Like, it's a game where when you shoot people, they're dead, and sometimes you too, but otherwise no. So for the rest of this talk, I'm going to give you more examples of games that systemize and contextualize player death poorly, and some games that have done the same but much better, and I'm going to talk about that, the way that games which handle player failure but are capable of conveying that information without anyone dying, along with games that don't necessarily need to be repeated after you failed because they've made their point. The purpose of this talk, I suppose, is to stop us thinking about death and restarting as the only way to account for player failure. And if we do include that, we should make the game about it. Alright, like with a lot of my opinions about video games, I've drawn them from my experience reviewing the video game Syndicate. I mean the 2011 remake, to be very clear. And maybe you barely remember that this came out, yeah. And for anybody that hasn't played it, it's a fairly uninteresting shooter that I hated playing, and you probably hate it too, but everyone in this room, if you are remotely interested in game design, you have to play this game because you can learn so much from it. Taken as a way to have remotely any fun whatsoever, it is a complete failure. But as a teaching tool to see why some systems fail to fully justify their inclusion, it is utterly unsurpassed. And if anybody in this room worked on that video game, I will buy you a drink afterwards, I'm sorry. Syndicate is the game that first made me start thinking about death and repetition as a way of learning from your mistakes. A lot of people would have said Dark Souls was the first game to do this, but knowing that game is entirely about repeating an area until you've been killed constantly until you know it inside out. Where Dark Souls makes an important effort to have the game's systems and narrative be entirely about death, Syndicate has absolutely nothing to offer you. It's not about death, it's just a game where you die and you come back to life for no reason. This stands out the most in a section a bit close to the end of the game. Every time you kill the boss, you remove a chip from their heads because it's a mature AAA video game. This is the case for every boss, and you kind of follow into a routine of immediately strolling over to their corpses after they die in order to lessen the amount of time you spend playing the video game Syndicate. So, one boss in this game drops a grenade when he dies, and he's the only one, and moving close to him in order to do a thing that the game's otherwise up until now asks you to do, it kills you, making you repeat the entire boss fight again. It's not good. I died because I was doing the exact same thing that the designer has up until this point asked me to do. And maybe they wanted to make a statement about my blind willingness to perform rogue action, and it might have worked at some point during the narrative, but really all I learned was, next time you want to do the thing, don't do the thing. Is that a lesson I needed to learn? Like, is my ability to play the video game Syndicate improved by this mechanic's inclusion? I've said a couple times that death in games is the player suboptimally understanding the systems, and if that's a decent enough explanation, in this instance, am I at fault for not understanding the systems properly, or is the developer? Am I bad at the game? Did I need to know more about how it works? I don't actually have an answer for that. I'm going to say it's their fault, but might be wrong. I don't know. Dennis Dyack would famously respond to criticism of the long wait between respawns and Silicon Knights as too humour. When the player character loses too many life points, there's an extended scene of them being picked up by a Valkyrie. Justifying this inclusion, Dyack suggested that this was a punishment, like an extra 30 seconds where whoever's in control has to sit still and think about the mistakes. It's a bit sadistic, isn't it? It's like, not only are you going to have to replay a moment you've already played, but you've got to wait to be able to do it. Dying in that game is already disincentivized. Does another punishment seem entirely fair? Should we even, at all, be punished for not understanding systems? I think this is why Dark Souls resonates with so many people. Like, it's got a lot to do with the world building and the lore and the graphical design and being about systems over spectacle, but it gets a lot of press for being difficult and having to play or die a lot, but it never feels frustrating because it's actually a game about death and repetition. XCOM 2 is difficult and features a lot of death, but it's actually about death and loss and repetition and perseverance despite odds. The same with Spelunky 2, it's a game about exploration and understanding systems and gaining knowledge and difficulty and having an experience. These last three examples are games about that feature death and are, in a lot of ways, absolutely about death. Hideo Kojima, toying with the idea of permanent player death in games, where if you die once, that's the entire end of the narrative. He once said that he'd like to design a game where if you died, your copy would instantly break and you'd never be able to play it again. I think that at the time, his rigid storytelling approach to game design, that was in quotations, that's an insult. That didn't account for more systems-based randomization that would make permadeath a more viable concept. Like, he was saying something that was a precursor to roguelikes or Spelunky, where the systems are exactly the same way each time you play, but then the world is randomized. It's a shitty idea. If we think about death as a way of a game telling you that you're getting another chance to try again, but it's a great idea if we're thinking about dying permanently as a method of emergent narrative. Because say you died and therefore you don't get to discover any more of an unfolding mystery. Your understanding of the world up until that point couldn't be challenged any further, and you'd reach different conclusions to a player who had more information. A few years later, Hideo's idea would be implemented into a flash game called One Chance. You're part of a team of scientists that have accidentally unleashed a world-ending virus in an attempt to cure cancer. You choose how you spend your days after this, either working to right the wrongs or possibly spending very brief remaining time with your wife and child. Whatever the outcome, the game ends as your progress is locked at a stack screen every time you return to the webpage. You might fail because you didn't manage your time correctly, but that's the total end of your story, and you've no way to learn from it. A game that actually considers failure and sees that enough of a statement in itself is Anna Anthropy's Dysphoria. It's my favourite game to redefine my understanding of failure in games. It's a short autobiographical story about transitioning, dealing with cultural projection, taking medication, seeing doctors, trying on clothes. The game consists of short interactive vignettes that crop up like you're playing WarioWare, quickly hoping that you'll understand the game through semiotics. Near the start of the game, it contextualizes through play a few actions that Anna would find herself in. Success in these is difficult but not impossible. Failure is kind of expected, but the narrative continues on regardless. You've not been successful, but the game's made its point about that being something difficult. Later on, these situations repeat, and they're impossible to fail. At this point, better representing Anna's growth and confidence. When you die in Too Human or whatever, that's just the game informing you of its own difficulty. And then, so what? Like, it's a difficult game I'm not good at. Who cares? Like, what is that saying? Does my perseverance, in spite of my failure, actually have narrative or systemic consequence? In Dysphoria, failure in these kinds of moments is a legitimate and meaningful statement. Later, your success in these same moments is an important part of the narrative. That's why I don't like Shadow of Mordor much. Because it's sort of a step toward what I want in games that include death. It's a game all about death and trying again. The narrative wrapper is pretty flimsy, but mechanically it's really interesting to play a game where death is inevitable and well thought out. The system's specific to this. Dying at the hands of a random enemy promotes an upper rank. You're allowed to be alive for a specific narrative reason. It is, I suppose, justifying its inclusion. It's just that player death in Shadow of Mordor is the most interesting thing that game offers, with it resetting the game's world and promoting enemies within it. But all of that is a reaction to a lack of player skill. The verbs of Mordor are all about player competence, but the game's at its most interesting when you've done terribly. It wants you to play well. It wants you to experience what happens when you play poorly. Dysphoria, comparatively, doesn't care much either way. I Get This Cool Every Day by David S. Gallen is a game about being confined to systems where your only option is to fail someone. You're a telephone representative for a company and a customer is attempting to access their account. They don't have the proper information to prove they are who they say they are, even though it's fairly clear they probably are. Sticking to what's expecting of you and preventing them from accessing their account means that you failed to help somebody who needed you. Helping them will result in your immediate termination, as you've potentially helped somebody commit fraud. Both of these results are easy to consider as win states and lose states at the same time. It's really interesting. It's a game with an ending where you've done what you've been told to do, but you still haven't been a success in any way. It's not about death at all, but more importantly, it's about justifying player failure, which really is the more important theme here. I timed this out before, and I usually don't get long enough to talk about the rest of the more important stuff, so think about failure in games that Bennett Foddy makes. The entire idea of QWOP and GURP is about not being able to properly understand control systems, even if there is an achievable goal by mastering them. Think about games like the excellent Papo and Yo, which is about being in danger, but it never ending in player death because the metaphor it presents has not actually resulted in that. And think about Kirby's Epic Yarn, which is a game about fun and joy, which never sees any main character death, but still manages to convey difficulty. And obviously, even though I mentioned it briefly earlier, think about Dark Souls as being a game specifically all about dying, restarting, and persevering. It is probably the best example, but it is really obvious. So. To sum all this up, death in games is bad, unless it's in Dark Souls, and I guess if you die in a game and have to repeat things over, make it about death and repetition. Otherwise, do something else. That's all I got. Yeah, what's up?
Have you played Rogue Legacy?
Yeah, mate.
No, just because I'm thinking it's a game where it's not particularly about death, but it justifies it. So it's sort of an implicit, because you play your own descendants and that.
It's true. Yeah, it's an interesting statement it makes. I just don't really like it. I think Spelunky's cool because it teaches you systems that you could then take forward into another game, but Rogue Legacy is so much about grinding. Like, it's just like the idea that I don't have access to all the things that would let me get through this game, even though I technically wouldn't have the ability to use them. It's just boring to me. But also, yeah, it's a good example. Okay. I don't know, you definitely put your hand up first time.
Where do you stand on the sands of time?
It's alright.
It's amazing.
Rewind and try again.
Yeah, it's really like on. What's up?
I'm interested in your thoughts on death in Viva Pinata.
That's sure. Can you explain that a little bit more, actually?
So Viva Pinata, you don't, as a player, obviously you don't know, you're an omniscient God created thing, but your animals die quite frequently when other animals, your pinata animals, are eaten.
And you're sort of in control of, like, you need them to die in order to progress the
narrative. And when they die, there is this joyous yay noise as dozens of children cheer and they explode into sweets, which are then consumed by the other animals. It's astonishingly gruesome, but also it's a really interesting way of death progressing a game forwards. Each one of these deaths represents can represent a significant loss, especially if it's like something you've spent a long time pulling together. But then I'm just talking.
No,
there's a moment later in the game where the bad guys turn up, and some of them have the ability to just kill your animals in really unpleasant ways. And like we ended up putting a dragon in a box and sending it away so that it wouldn't get hurt. And basically, I don't know where I'm going with this. Other than that, I'm really interested in your thoughts on this. If you haven't played Viva Pinata, I would seriously recommend you doing so because you've got some really interesting stuff going on with that.
Thank you very much. What's up?
Have you played The Edge of Tomorrow yet?
Oh, that's like an iOS thing, isn't it? Right? What is it? I haven't even seen the movie, dude.
You've not, I've not seen the movie.
Played the game, though?
Yeah. You've not played it, never mind.
Okay.
It's a first-person shooter. You start on the beach. You know the level in Call of Duty where you just go on the beach?
Yeah, every Call of Duty.
So it's that, and you go forward and the enemies are in exactly the same places every time. They basically kill you in one hit.
But you know when you play it again.
Yeah.
That's a good example of like the concept being translated from movie to game.
No narrative.
That seems pretty good. I'm into that.
I was going to ask you your thoughts on that.
I appreciate what I've heard of it so far. Hello, what's up?
One thought that I had, which also goes back to Grant and Mary's talk a moment ago, is that the problem arrives the moment that you introduce a weapon of some sort into a game. So if you're trying to look for alternatives to dying, and you've got people with weapons, you've got weapons, at some point you are going to be killed by weapons.
I read an interesting thing about this like a couple of years ago, and maybe I don't even have anything to say about this, but somebody thought about the idea of like third-person shooters as power fantasy, and about how it seemed really unnecessary for you to die in those because they're drawing from movies with like big action heroes who never die. So they suggested the idea of like, you know how like stormtroopers never actually hit Luke Skywalker, like they always miss. Like they can sort of present it in exactly the same way. Like there are dudes with guns and you need to run past them, but like do they have to kill you? Like, right? Yeah, that's my kind of seed of a thought, I guess. Yeah. What's up, buddy?
Actually, kind of repetition of previous questions. So two games that have interesting death mechanics. Steel Battalion.
Ooh, yeah, you're right. That's really good.
Steel Battalion has, if you die, you lose your entire save game, but there's a lesser death mechanic where you eject and then you have to replay.
Yeah, I thought that's about Eve in this as well, like for kind of the same reasons. But I've never played Eve. Yeah, who's played Eve?
I actually did play through college and pay for most of it through Eve. However, I only had a subscription for 6 months of that. The rest I looked at a big spreadsheet. Those people really exist. I'm not going to.
How would you go for this? I think you go.
You have got you went way past your slot a while back.
What's up? Was there anything? No, I thought I still wrote that in that direction. Oh gosh, hey, what's up?
This isn't actually like a video game example.
No, this is perfect, please. I'm being serious. I hate talking about video games. Like, no, that sounds like a big sarcastic, but no, please.
Okay, that's good because I can't really read sarcasm very well. It's difficult in London. So I play a RPG, like live role-playing game things, and there's a really cool Call of Cthulhu game where you know that you're going to die at the end, or go insane, or be transported to another dimension. It actually makes it more fun, because you're like, right, what's the most dangerous thing I can do? Let's go and do that.
Yeah. Like, it's there's a game called Dread, and you play it with a Jenga set.
Yes!
Yeah, it's so good. Like, when the Jenga set falls, whoever knocked it over has to die in that narrative. But you could purposefully just like push the net, like the set over, just be like, no, I died at this point, but I'm going to do something spectacular. It's
Save your friends.
Yeah. I wish I wasn't talking about video games, man. Right. Okay, cool. Right. Thank you very much.